In 2014, when the Ethiopian government announced plans to expand the limits of the capital city into parts of Oromia, it opened up a can of worms, grievances that had been simmering since the current government took power in 1991 and even further back to the reign of Emperor Menelik II. Government officials said the plan would develop areas adjacent to the capital, but protesters feared the plan would displace farmers and result in state land grabbing. The government taking Oromo land has been a deep-rooted issue since imperial times. Protests began in a small town called Ginchi, and then spread to other schools, universities, rural and small towns, says Dr. Aseba Regasa Debello, who is a professor at Dilla University in southern Ethiopia.
Land expropriation is not only in Oromia. It has been there also in smaller regions, particularly in peripheral areas. But Oromia is geographically suitable for, I would say, land expropriation.
That's because it is geographically the economic and political center of Ethiopia.
The largest proportion of Oromia is resourceful in terms of agricultural land, even in terms of natural resources like mining, gold, tantalum, other minerals are also mainly extracted from Oromia.
Although the government halted its plans, the protest, marred by violent demonstrators, only stopped briefly before restarting in 2015.
But it took actually a different dimension and a different issues came up. Not only the master plan, but also the issues of the general land grabbing areas in different parts of Oromia, the issue that different political prisoners should be released, and other questions of equal representations in the politics, in the economy, and in social affairs.
The government officially canceled the master plan in January 2016, but protests continued. Then things escalated in October 2016 during a spiritual and cultural festival celebrated by Oromos called Erecha.
Beginning from 2014, the relationship between the state and the society was conflictual. The youth, whenever they got the opportunity to gather, they were expressing their disappointment, resentment, and everything. They were chanting that political prisoners should be released, land confiscation should be stopped, and so on, even during that festival. The government was also, in a way, suspecting that the youth would use that opportunity to reflect their disappointment and their resentment.
Government forces reportedly fired tear gas to disperse protesters. The crowd of an estimated 2 million panicked and a stampede ensued, resulting in 50 to over 600 deaths, depending on the source. Protesters began violent and deadly attacks on government property and foreign companies and civilians, prompting the government to declare a state of emergency.
During that period, the government reduced that into a good governance issue, actually. They made some reshuffling in government administrative positions and promised that there would be a very deep-rooted reform. But that didn't make actually a significant change.
But the protests resulted in new faces taking the helm of the governing party of the Oromia region. That party is called the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, and it's one of the 4 groups that make up the coalition of the ruling party. The ruling party is the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, called EPRDF for short.
Following the coming to position of the new regional president and his cabinet, His Excellency Lemma Magarsa, the political party from Oromia got, relatively speaking, a kind of legitimacy. But that also seems created internal, what we can say, inter-party struggles and lack of trust, because the regional administrator in Oromia started to address some of a kind of major issues that the Oromo protests were raising. For example, the issues of contraband, the issues of redistributing land, for example, to the youth and others were some of the measures. And that was not mainly accepted by the other party members, particularly by the TPLF. That was my speculation. The problems that happened, the crisis that happened, the government took responsibility for that.
But just as tensions were calming in 2017, clashes between the Oromia and Somali regional states escalated, killing hundreds. Some Oromos accused Somali special police forces of instigating the conflict, but Somali officials denied the claims, blaming the violence on Oromo officials who they say sympathize with the outlawed political group known as the Oromo Liberation Front, according to a BBC News report.
It was almost some 10 years ago that these Somali militias were established. The government wanted to, in a way, outsource the fighting against the ONLF, which is the Ogaden National Liberation Front, so that the Somali militia would fight against the ONLF within the Somali regional states. And also they were to defend against the kind of threat against Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Because of this, they were well equipped, well trained. They have a very modern, high-level machineries and other equipment. When they started this attack against the Oromia regional state, then there was no equivalent force from Oromia regional state, because constitutionally, regional states have the right and the mandate to establish regional police forces, but not special forces like that. So the Oromia regional state had its own regional police force, which is called Oromia Police, until recently, until the last level when the defense became inevitable and necessary. It didn't get the permission from the regional states to fight against the Somali militia, because usually in the past, pastoralist areas, for example, fight over grazing lands or over water and so on, then regional states do not really mobilize their regional police forces against civilians in a normal condition. But when the invasion became destructive, then Oromia regional state also mobilized its regional police force to defend the civilians. In September last year, during the high level of such displacement and attacks, the federal government mobilized or intervened through the defense forces, but there were different accusations that it took side, even in the presence of the federal military force. Then the Somali militias were attacking civilians, even in their presence and so on. And even in some cases, there were records that the federal military force and the defense forces were also attacking the civilians while they were either in the camps or while they were fleeing from the threat areas.
There's two main speculations about what's provoking the attacks. One is the border dispute between the two regions. The Norway-based Internal Displacement Monitoring Center documents conflict between the two regions over resources going back to 2003, when 19,000 were displaced because of fighting. A referendum was held in 2004 to determine how the boundary should be delimited, but the referendum only intensified the hostility and increased the displacement, even though the results of the referendum were never enforced. Preliminary data from the UN's International Organization for Migration puts the displacement number at about 1 million since 2015. Another possible reason is the crackdown on contrabands in the Oromia region.
Many things are coming in and going out. It goes from food items, construction materials.
There are two major routes in Oromia, one to Kenya and the other to Djibouti, which makes smuggling goods in and out of the country possible.
So it affects the business activities in Oromia. It affects also the taxation system and everything in the region. And the other regional states are not as equally affected by this trade, although the broader effect can be seen from the national level.
There were also reports of money laundering.
People were taking dollars abroad. It was having a very serious implication on the economy, because these people do not pay any custom, any taxation, and it also affects the business activities of those who legally import and export things. Once this trade route, the informal illegal trade route, was controlled by the Oromia regional state, then these major actors, which might involve high-profile government officials, military personnel, security individuals, and so on, once their interest was blocked, then they went to another dimension. Particularly, the idea was to weaken the Oromia regional state. It was another way of a proxy war.